Sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places, and sometimes a single promise can change the course of two lives forever. Emma Kate Sullivan had spent her entire 23 years believing that poverty was her destiny, that the cramped tenement rooms and endless factory shifts were all life would ever offer her. She never imagined that fleeing into the treacherous Appalachian wilderness would lead her to a man who would look into her desperate eyes and declare words that would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. Daniel Mitchell had carved out his empire in the unforgiving mountains of Copper Ridge, turning copper veins and timber stands into a fortune that rivaled the wealthiest men back east. But all his riches meant nothing until the day a half-starved girl stumbled onto his land, and he found himself making a promise that would cost him everything he'd built, yet give him everything he'd ever truly wanted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind howled through the peaks of Copper Ridge like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter West Virginia had seen in a generation. Daniel Mitchell stood on the wraparound porch of his timber mansion, watching the storm clouds gather over the valley below, and felt the familiar ache in his left knee where shrapnel from a mining accident had lodged itself 5 years back. The weather always found that old wound, reminding him that even with all his wealth, some scars never fully healed. His estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of the richest mountain land in the territory, encompassing copper mines that produced more ore than any operation south of Pittsburgh, timber stands that fed the growing railroad expansion, and enough fertile valleys to support cattle herds that grazed year-round on protected pastures. The house itself was a testament to what determination and shrewd business sense could accomplish. 3 stories of solid oak and stone that commanded a view of everything he owned, from the mining operations in the eastern hollows to the sawmill complexes along Whitmore Creek. But tonight, as the wind rattled the hand-blown glass windows that had been shipped from Cincinnati at considerable expense, Daniel felt the familiar emptiness that no amount of success could fill. He'd built this empire with his own hands, starting with nothing but a worn-out mining claim his father had left him and the stubborn refusal to accept that mountain folk were destined to stay poor. 15 years of back-breaking labor, dangerous gambles, and calculated risks had transformed him from Danny Mitchell, dirt-poor miner's son, into Daniel Mitchell, the copper king of Appalachia. The local papers wrote about him with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, calling him everything from a visionary businessman to a ruthless opportunist who'd forgotten his humble origins. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between the extremes. He'd made enemies on his climb to the top, certainly, men who'd tried to cheat him out of claims or force him to sell his land for pennies on the dollar. But he'd also employed half the men in 3 counties, paid wages that allowed families to own their own homes instead of renting company shacks, and built the schoolhouse in Millbrook Valley with his own money when the state refused to fund education for mountain children. What the papers never wrote about, what the business associates who visited his office in town never saw, was the profound loneliness that filled the elegant rooms of his mountain mansion. He'd designed every inch of the place with meticulous care, importing craftsmen from back east to install mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers, commissioning furniture that would have been at home in the finest Charleston parlors. But all the luxury in the world couldn't change the fact that he was the only person who lived there, the only voice that echoed through corridors built to house a family he'd never had. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, came up from town 3 times a week to clean and stock the pantries, but she always returned to her own family before dark, leaving him alone with his books and his brandy and the vast silence that money couldn't purchase companions to fill. He'd courted a few ladies over the years, respectable daughters of merchants and lawyers who saw his wealth and overlooked his rough edges, but those relationships had withered under the weight of expectation and calculation. They wanted the security his fortune could provide, the social status that came with being Mrs. Daniel Mitchell, but none of them had ever looked at him and seen simply the man beneath the reputation. The mining operations that formed the backbone of his wealth were marvels of efficiency and innovation, employing techniques he'd learned from German engineers and equipment he'd imported at enormous cost from Pennsylvania foundries. His miners worked shorter shifts than most operations, earned better wages, and had access to company doctors when accidents happened. But the work was still dangerous, still dirty, still the kind of labor that separated the desperate from the comfortable with unforgiving clarity. The timber business had grown almost by accident, starting when he needed lumber for his own construction projects and realized that the vast forests covering his land represented a fortune in themselves. Now his sawmills processed logs, not just for local use, but for shipment to growing cities throughout the Ohio Valley, where his mountain timber became the framework for banks and hotels and the grand houses of industrialists who'd never seen the forests where their luxury or preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Originated. His cattle operation was smaller, but perhaps the most personally satisfying of his enterprises, reminding him of the days when his family had owned a few head of livestock and considered themselves wealthy when the cows produced enough milk to sell in town. Now his herds numbered in the hundreds, managed by cowhands who respected him for his knowledge of the land and the animals, rather than simply his ability to pay their wages. The evening routine had become as predictable as the sunset that painted the western peaks in shades of gold and crimson. He'd review the day's reports from his various foremen, noting production figures and labor issues with the same attention to detail that had built his fortune. Then he'd prepare his own dinner in the mansion's modern kitchen, having never gotten comfortable with the idea of servants living under his roof, even though he could easily afford a full staff. The kitchen itself was a study in contradictions, equipped with the latest innovations in cast iron stoves and ice preservation techniques, but stocked with simple mountain fare that reminded him of his origins. He could prepare elaborate meals when the mood struck him, having taught himself to cook from books written by French chefs, but more often he satisfied himself with cornbread and beans, fried ham and potatoes, the foods that had sustained him through the lean years when success was still a distant dream. After dinner, he'd retire to his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books he'd acquired, not for show but for genuine education. History and philosophy, engineering manuals and geological surveys, poetry and novels that transported him to worlds far removed from the practical concerns of mining and timber. Reading had been his escape during the hardest years, when physical exhaustion made sleep elusive and worry about the next day's challenges kept his mind racing through the small hours of the night. His desk was a massive piece of furniture carved from a single oak tree that had grown on his own land, its surface covered with the tools of modern business, steel nib pens and leather-bound ledgers, correspondence from suppliers and customers, maps marking new claims and expansion opportunities. But tucked into one drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth against the mountain humidity, were items that revealed the man behind the businessman. A daguerreotype of his parents taken shortly before they died in the mine collapse that had left him orphaned at 19. And a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother, its pages marked with verses she'd read to him when he was small. The loneliness wasn't something he discussed with anyone, wasn't a weakness he allowed himself to acknowledge during business hours when his reputation for strength and decisiveness was essential to maintaining the respect of men who worked for him, and the fear of competitors who might otherwise try to challenge his position. But in the evening silence of his mountain palace, surrounded by all the evidence of his material success, he couldn't escape the knowledge that he'd traded human connection for financial security, warmth for wealth, love for the cold satisfaction of victory over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. The storm that was building beyond his windows would bring the first serious snow of the season. He could tell from the particular quality of the wind and the way the temperature had dropped throughout the afternoon. His experience reading mountain weather had been earned through years of necessity, when a mistake in judgment could mean being trapped in a mine during a flash flood, or caught in the open during a blizzard that could kill the unprepared. Now that knowledge served him in business, allowing him to plan operations around weather patterns and seasonal changes that his competitors often failed to anticipate. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges, reports from the mines about equipment repairs and workforce issues, decisions about timber contracts and shipping schedules. The endless details that kept his empire functioning smoothly. But tonight, as he stood watching the approaching storm and feeling the weight of his solitary success, Daniel Mitchell found himself wondering if there might be something more valuable than security. Something more precious than the gold and copper and timber that had made him the richest man in 3 counties. He'd built everything he'd ever dreamed of having. created a legacy that would endure long after he was gone, proven that a poor mountain boy could rise above his circumstances through determination and intelligence and sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitations. But standing in the growing darkness, listening to the wind promise a harsh winter ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in his climb to the top, he'd lost something essential, something that all his wealth couldn't buy back. The mansion around him was warm and secure, stocked with enough supplies to weather any storm, protected by the kind of prosperity that most men could only dream of achieving. But it was also empty, echoing with the absence of voices that had never filled its rooms, haunted by the family that existed only in his imagination, the wife and children who might have made all his success meaningful in ways that profit margins and expansion plans never could. As the first snowflakes began to fall beyond the glow of his porch lanterns, Daniel Mitchell retreated inside his fortress of wealth and success, unaware that the storm approaching his mountain would bring with it the one thing his fortune couldn't purchase, the one treasure that would make all his promises of abundance finally come true. Part 2. The Catalyst Event. The blizzard struck Copper Ridge with a fury that reminded every soul within 50 miles why the old-timers spoke of winter with the same reverence they reserved for death and taxes. Kate Sullivan had been walking for 3 days straight, her thin-soled boots long since worn through to bloody blisters, her threadbare coat no match for the mountain cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She'd left the grimy streets of Pittsburgh with nothing but $17 stolen from the factory foreman's desk, a few scraps of food wrapped in newspaper, and the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast wilderness of West Virginia, she could disappear completely. The factory had been her prison for 6 years, ever since her parents had died in the typhoid outbreak that swept through the Irish tenements like God's own judgment. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, she'd stood at the textile looms, breathing lint and machine oil, watching her youth slip away one monotonous shift at a time. The other girls spoke of marriage as their escape, but Kate had learned early that marriage often meant trading one form of bondage for another, especially when you had nothing to offer but willing hands and a pretty face. Victor Blackwood had noticed her pretty face 3 months ago, when he'd toured the factory floor with the other investors, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as clearly as if he'd worn a crown. He was older, perhaps 45, with the soft features of a man who'd never known real hardship, and eyes that lingered too long on the female workers as he discussed productivity improvements with the floor supervisors. When he'd stopped at her station, asking questions about her work that had nothing to do with textile production, Kate had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty factory windows. The courtship, if it could be called that, had been swift and suffocating. Expensive gifts delivered to her boarding house, invitations to restaurants where the cost of a single meal would have fed her for a week, promises of a life of comfort and security that seemed too good to be true. Because they were too good to be true, the other girls had envied her apparent good fortune, but Kate had seen something in Victor's smile that reminded her of the cats that hunted rats in the factory basement, patient and cruel and absolutely certain of their eventual success. The proposal had come with conditions that made her stomach turn, expectations about wifely duties that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with ownership. When she'd tried to decline politely, Victor's mask had slipped, revealing the calculated predator beneath the gentleman's facade. He'd made it clear that her employment, her housing, even her safety depended on his goodwill, and goodwill was something he dispensed only to those who understood their proper place in his world. So she'd run, taking only what she could carry, and praying that the mountain wilderness would hide her better than the crowded city streets ever could. For 3 days she'd followed railroad tracks and logging roads, staying off the main highways where Victor's money might have hired men to search for her. She'd slept in abandoned barns and eaten berries that made her stomach cramp, but freedom had tasted sweeter than any meal she'd known in years. Now, as the snow began to fall in earnest and the temperature dropped toward deadly levels, Kate realized that freedom might be a luxury she couldn't afford. The thin dress that had been adequate for city life offered no protection against mountain weather, and the worn shawl she'd wrapped around her shoulders was already stiff with ice. Her hands had lost feeling hours ago, and each step sent pain shooting through feet that were more blister than skin. The wind picked up as darkness fell, turning the snowfall into a whirling wall of white that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Emma Kate stumbled forward blindly, her only goal to keep moving, to fight off the deadly sleep that hypothermia promised to those who gave up the struggle. She'd heard stories of people found frozen in the spring thaw, peaceful expressions on their faces, as if they'd simply decided to rest for a moment and never awakened. That's when she saw the light, a warm golden glow that seemed impossibly distant through the swirling snow, but unmistakably real, unmistakably hope. She forced her numb legs to carry her toward that beacon, falling twice in the deep drifts but pulling herself upright each time through sheer determination. The light grew brighter as she approached, resolving into the welcoming windows of the largest house she'd ever seen, a mansion that seemed to rise from the mountainside like something from a fairy tale. The final 100 yards tested every reserve of strength she possessed, each step a conscious victory over the cold that wanted to claim her. By the time she reached the broad front porch, her vision was blurring, and her heartbeat had slowed to an irregular rhythm that she dimly recognized as dangerous. She managed to climb the wooden steps, her frozen hands unable to grasp the railing properly, and stumbled toward the massive oak door that represented her last chance at survival. She tried to knock, but her fists made no sound against the heavy wood, her strength finally failing completely. Instead, she collapsed against the door, her body sliding down the painted surface until she crumpled on the porch boards, consciousness fading as the storm raged around her sanctuary. The last thing she remembered was the sound of footsteps from inside, heavy and purposeful, and the wild hope that someone, anyone, might find her before the mountain claimed another victim. Daniel Mitchell had been reading by the fireplace when his hound dog, Captain, began barking with the particular urgency reserved for genuine emergencies. The animal had been his companion for 8 years, a gift from one of his miners whose own dog had produced an unexpected litter, and in all that time Captain had never raised a false alarm. When the barking continued and took on a note of distress that Daniel had learned to recognize, he set aside his book and reached for the heavy coat that hung by the door. The storm was worse than he'd anticipated, the wind driving snow with enough force to sting exposed skin and make breathing difficult. Captain was pacing back and forth on the porch, whining and pawing at something dark huddled against the front door. Daniel's first thought was that an animal had sought shelter, perhaps a deer driven down from the high country by the weather, but as he approached with his lantern raised high, the light revealed something that made his heart nearly stop. It was a young woman, unconscious and clearly near death from exposure, her lips blue with cold and her breathing so shallow that he had to kneel and place his ear close to her mouth to confirm she was still alive. Ice crystals had formed in her dark hair, and her skin felt like marble under his touch, cold and lifeless in a way that spoke of minutes rather than hours before the cold claimed her completely. Without hesitation, Daniel scooped her into his arms, noting how light she felt, how fragile her bones seemed beneath the inadequate layers of her city clothes. She was beautiful, he realized with a part of his mind that seemed separate from the immediate crisis. Beautiful in a refined way that spoke of education and good breeding, though her clothes were worn, and her hands showed the calluses of manual labor. What was a woman like this doing alone on his mountain in the middle of a blizzard? Inside the mansion, he carried her directly to the guest bedroom on the first floor, the room closest to the main fireplace where the heat would be most effective. He'd dealt with frostbite cases before, had seen what happened when miners were caught in sudden weather changes or trapped in flooded shafts, and he knew that warming had to be gradual and careful to avoid causing more damage than the cold itself. Her boots came off first, expensive leather things that had been quality once but were now soaked through and frozen solid. Her feet were pale but not blackened, which meant she'd keep all her toes if he acted quickly and correctly. The dress was another matter entirely, thin cotton that provided no insulation and was wet through from melted snow. Propriety demanded he preserve her modesty, but survival trumped social conventions, and he worked efficiently to remove the sodden garments and wrap her in warm woolen blankets from his own bed. He built up the fire until the room felt like a furnace. Then began the delicate process of restoring circulation to her extremities, rubbing her hands and feet with gentle pressure while heated water on the stove. Too much warmth too quickly could cause tissue damage, but too little would mean losing the race against hypothermia that was still claiming her strength with each shallow breath. For the first hour, she remained completely unconscious, her breathing so faint that he found himself checking repeatedly to ensure she was still alive. Gradually, as warmth began to penetrate the deadly cold that had invaded her core, her circulation improved and her breathing deepened. Color returned to her lips, and her pulse grew stronger beneath his fingers when he checked it at her wrist. When she finally stirred, it was with the confused movements of someone emerging from a deep dream, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned slowly and reluctantly. Her eyes, when they finally opened fully, were the clearest blue he'd ever seen, like mountain lakes reflecting summer sky, and they focused on his face with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of his rough appearance, his work-calloused hands, the way his voice would sound after hours of silence. She tried to speak, but no words came, her throat too dry and damaged by the cold to produce sound. Daniel quickly brought her a cup of warm broth he'd prepared while she was unconscious, supporting her head gently as she sipped the nourishing liquid that would help restore her strength from the inside. The simple act of caring for her, of being needed in such a fundamental way, stirred something in his chest that he thought permanently buried beneath years of solitary success. "You're safe," he said simply, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "The storm can't reach you here." And as she looked up at him with gratitude and trust that he hadn't earned but desperately wanted to deserve, Daniel Mitchell felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to be wealthy, what it meant to have everything a man could want, and what it meant to find treasure in the most unexpected places. Part 3. Protagonist's Hidden Depths. The woman who had nearly died on his doorstep slept for 18 hours straight, her body recovering from an ordeal that would have killed someone with less determination or worse luck. During those long hours, as Daniel maintained his vigil in the chair beside her bed, he found himself studying her face and wondering about the circumstances that had brought her to his remote mountain refuge. Her hands, when he'd examined them for frostbite damage, told a story of hard work and recent hardship, but her features spoke of breeding and education that didn't match the desperate flight that had nearly cost her life. While she slept, Daniel prepared himself for the questions that would inevitably come when she awakened fully, questions about who he was and how he'd come to possess such wealth in a place where most families struggled to survive from one season to the next. The truth was complicated, bound up with choices he'd made, and opportunities he'd seized that had transformed him from the Daniel Mitchell his neighbors remembered into someone they barely recognized. He'd been born in a 2-room cabin 15 miles down the mountain, the son of Irish immigrants who'd traded the potato famines of County Cork for the coal mines of West Virginia. His father, Patrick Mitchell, had been a good man who'd worked himself to death trying to provide for his family, spending 12 hours a day in tunnels that claimed a man's lungs if the cave-ins didn't claim his life first. His mother, Bridget, had taken in washing and mending to supplement the family income, her fingers permanently stained with lye soap and her back bent from hours over the washboard. Young Danny Mitchell had grown up understanding that poverty was a trap that claimed entire generations, that without education and opportunity, a man was doomed to repeat his father's struggles without hope of improvement. He'd walked 6 miles each way to attend the one-room schoolhouse in Millbrook Valley, often arriving with feet wrapped in rags because his family couldn't afford proper shoes, but determined to learn everything the traveling teachers could offer. The turning point had come when he was 16, working summers in the copper mine that employed most of the local men. A tunnel collapse had trapped him and 2 other miners for 4 days, and during those dark hours when death seemed more likely than rescue, Danny had experienced a revelation that would shape the rest of his life. He'd realized that he had 2 choices: accept the limitations that circumstances had placed on him, or fight with everything he possessed to create a different future. When the rescue team finally Danny Mitchell emerged from that mine shaft as a different person, someone who understood that survival wasn't enough, that a man had to take control of his own destiny, or watch it be determined by forces beyond his influence. He'd started studying geology and mineralogy, teaching himself from books he borrowed or bought with money saved from his mining wages, learning to read the land in ways that most men never considered. The old copper claim that his father had left him was considered worthless by everyone who knew it. A played-out hole in the ground that hadn't produced significant ore in 20 years. But Danny's newfound knowledge suggested that the previous miners had been looking in the wrong places, following veins that had been mined out while missing the geological indicators that pointed to much richer deposits, deeper in the mountain. He'd spent 2 years working other men's claims during the day, and exploring his own property by night, mapping the underground formations and testing samples with techniques he'd learned from correspondence courses offered by mining colleges back east. When he finally struck the mother lode, a copper vein so rich it defied belief, he'd been smart enough to keep the discovery secret, while he quietly bought up every adjacent claim he could afford. The legal battles that followed had tested every ounce of determination he possessed, as established mining companies tried to claim his discoveries through manipulation of claim dates and property boundaries. But Danny had learned to read contracts as carefully as he read geological surveys, and he'd allied himself with lawyers who shared his hunger for success, rather than those who simply wanted to maintain the existing order. The wealth had come gradually at first, then in an avalanche that transformed not just his own circumstances but the entire economy of the region. His mines employed hundreds of men at wages that allowed them to buy their own homes instead of renting company shacks, and his insistence on safety procedures had reduced accidents to a fraction of what other operations experienced. But success had also meant leaving behind the community that had shaped him, becoming someone who inspired more awe than affection from people who'd known him since childhood. The timber business had grown from necessity, as his mining operations required vast quantities of lumber for support structures and buildings. Rather than pay the inflated prices that established lumber companies demanded, he'd surveyed his own forest land and discovered stands of virgin timber that represented fortunes in themselves. His sawmills now processed logs not just for his own use, but for export to growing cities throughout the Ohio Valley, where his mountain timber became the framework for banks and mansions and the grand hotels, where wealthy men conducted the business that shaped the nation's future. The cattle operation had been a return to his roots, a reminder of the days when his family had owned 3 cows, and considered themselves prosperous when the animals produced enough milk to sell in town. Now his herds numbered in the hundreds, managed according to principles he'd learned from agricultural colleges and breeding techniques that had transformed his mountain pastures into some of the most productive grazing land in the state. But perhaps the most significant change in Daniel Mitchell's life had been the education he'd given himself. The transformation from an illiterate miner's son into a man who could hold his own in conversations with engineers and geologists, lawyers and businessmen, politicians and professors who visited his operations or sought his investment in their own ventures. His library now contained over 3,000 volumes, everything from classical literature to the latest scientific treatises, and he taught himself to speak passable French and German to communicate with the European experts he occasionally imported to consult on technical problems. The mansion that had sheltered his unexpected guest was itself a testament to this transformation. Designed not to impress visitors but to create the kind of home he'd dreamed of during the years when his family had crowded into 2 rooms with a dirt floor and windows covered with oiled paper instead of glass. Every room had been planned with meticulous attention to both comfort and function, from the modern kitchen with its cast-iron stoves and ice preservation systems to the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the best natural light. His workshop occupied an entire wing of the house, equipped with tools and instruments that allowed him to continue his geological research and mining innovations. The laboratory where he tested ore samples and experimented with new extraction techniques was as well equipped as any university facility, and his collection of maps and geological surveys covered not just West Virginia but potential mining regions throughout the American West. The social isolation that had accompanied his rise to wealth was perhaps the heaviest price he'd paid for his success. Men who had once been his friends now treated him with a deference that made genuine conversation impossible, while the educated elite of Charleston and Richmond society accepted his money while never quite forgetting his humble origins. He existed in a space between worlds, too wealthy for his old community but too recently elevated for complete acceptance by established society. His correspondence with business associates and technical experts provided intellectual stimulation, but it couldn't replace the simple human connections that had sustained him during his youth. He'd tried courtship several times, pursuing relationships with women who seemed compatible with his new position. But those efforts had foundered on the reality that his wealth attracted more interest than his character, and his mountain home felt too remote for women accustomed to city society. The loneliness had become such a constant companion that he'd almost stopped noticing it, the way a man might stop noticing a chronic ache that never quite disappeared. But sitting beside the bed of the mysterious woman who'd nearly died on his doorstep, watching her sleep with the peaceful expression of someone who'd finally found safety, Daniel realized how hungry he'd become for simple human connection, for the opportunity to care for someone who needed him not for his money or his influence, but for the basic kindness that wealth couldn't purchase. When she stirred again, turning her head restlessly on the pillow as consciousness began to return, Daniel found himself hoping that whatever had driven her to his mountain was something he could solve, some problem that his resources could address. For the first time in years, he had something more valuable than copper ore or timber contracts to protect. Something that made all his careful planning and calculated investment seem like preparation for this moment when he could finally put his wealth to its highest purpose. Part 4. The rescue and initial trust. Kate awakened to sensations that seemed impossible after the numbing cold that had nearly claimed her life, warmth that penetrated all the way to her bones and softness beneath her body that felt like the finest hotel accommodations she'd ever imagined. The room around her was unlike anything she'd experienced. Elegant furnishings that spoke of wealth beyond her understanding, but more importantly, it was warm and safe and filled with the gentle light of a fire that crackled in a stone fireplace larger than the entire room she'd rented in Pittsburgh. The man sitting in the chair beside her bed was watching her with dark eyes that held concern and intelligence in equal measure, and she realized with a start that he was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with fine clothes or careful grooming. His face was weathered by outdoor work but strong-featured, with a kind of bone structure that suggested both determination and kindness. His hands, folded calmly in his lap, were clearly accustomed to physical labor, but his posture and the way he spoke suggested education that went far beyond what she'd expected from a mountain dweller. "How are you feeling?" His voice was deep and careful, with just a trace of an accent that suggested Irish heritage tempered by years of conscious refinement. "You've been sleeping for nearly a day, which is probably what you needed after what you went through out there." She tried to speak but found her throat still raw from the cold and the fear that had driven her flight from Pittsburgh. He seemed to understand her difficulty and quickly brought her a cup of warm tea that tasted of honey and herbs she couldn't identify, but which soothed her damaged throat and seemed to restore strength to her entire body. "My name is Daniel Mitchell," he said, settling back into his chair with the patient air of a man who had all the time in the world to wait for her recovery. "This is my home, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to regain your strength. The storm that brought you here is still raging, and it wouldn't be safe for anyone to travel for several days at least." Kate managed to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm Kate Sullivan, and I'm more grateful than I can express for your kindness. I thought I was going to die out there." The admission brought back the memory of that desperate struggle through the snow, the growing certainty that she'd made a fatal mistake in fleeing into the wilderness without adequate preparation. "You very nearly did," Daniel replied with gentle honesty. "Another hour in that storm would have been too much for anyone to survive. What brought you up into these mountains in weather like this? It's not exactly tourist season in Copper Ridge." The question she'd been dreading, the moment when she'd have to decide how much truth to reveal to this stranger who'd saved her life. Kate studied his face, searching for any sign of the calculating interest she'd learned to recognize in men who saw women as opportunities rather than people. Instead, she found only genuine concern, and the kind of patience that suggested he'd wait for her answer without pressure or judgment. "I was running away," she said finally, deciding that partial honesty was better than complete deception. "From a situation in Pittsburgh that had become impossible to endure. I thought the mountains might offer a place to disappear, to start over where no one would think to look for me." Daniel nodded as if desperate flights into the wilderness were perfectly reasonable responses to impossible situations. Sometimes a person has to leave everything behind to find out who they really are. I understand something about starting over, about choosing a different life than the one circumstances originally offered. There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with radical change, with the kind of transformation that required abandoning one identity to create another. Kate felt herself relaxing slightly, sensing that whatever judgment this man might pass on her choices, it wouldn't come from someone who'd never faced difficult decisions himself. "Are you hungry?" he asked, rising from his chair with movements that were both graceful and purposeful. Mrs. Patterson, my housekeeper, prepared enough soup to feed half the county before she headed home ahead of the storm. It's nothing fancy, but it's nourishing, and you need to rebuild your strength. The soup, when he brought it, was rich with vegetables and tender meat that had been simmered for hours to perfect tenderness. Kate realized she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, had been surviving on scraps and berries that had done little to sustain her strength for the ordeal she'd endured. As she ate, she became aware of the room around her, the quality of the furnishings that spoke of wealth managed with taste rather than ostentation. "You must think I'm terribly foolish," she said between spoonfuls of the restorative broth, running off into the mountains like some character from a romantic novel, with no real plan and no understanding of what I was getting myself into. "I think you're brave," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Foolhardy perhaps, but brave in a way that most people never manage to be. It takes tremendous courage to walk away from the familiar, even when the familiar is making you miserable. Not everyone has the strength to choose uncertainty over guaranteed unhappiness." His words were like a balm to wounds she hadn't realized were still bleeding, validation for choices that had seemed increasingly questionable during her desperate flight through the wilderness. For the first time since leaving Pittsburgh, Kate felt that perhaps her decision hadn't been entirely mad, that there might be wisdom in trusting her instincts even when they led her into unknown territory. "Tell me about this place," she said, gesturing toward the windows where snow still swirled beyond the warm light of the room. "How did you come to have such a beautiful home in such a remote location? It seems like something from a fairy tale, a palace hidden away in the mountains where ordinary rules don't apply." Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his serious features into something that was both boyish and deeply attractive. "Copper Ridge isn't quite a fairy tale kingdom, though I suppose it might seem that way to someone who's spent time in Pittsburgh. The mountains here are rich in copper and timber, and I've been fortunate enough to build a business that's allowed me to create the kind of home I always dreamed of having." The modesty of his explanation didn't quite match the evidence of wealth that surrounded them, but Kate sensed that he was a man who preferred to let his achievements speak for themselves rather than boasting about his success. There was something refreshing about his understated confidence, so different from the men she'd known who felt compelled to announce their importance to anyone who would listen. "Are you married?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at her own boldness. "I'm sorry, that's terribly forward of me. I just wondered because the house seems so large for one person, and you've been taking care of me yourself rather than calling for a wife or family member." "No," Daniel said simply, and she thought she detected a note of loneliness in his voice that echoed her own. "I've been alone here for quite some time. Long enough that having someone to care for feels like a privilege rather than an obligation." The honesty of his response touched something deep in Kate's chest, a recognition of shared isolation that had nothing to do with physical circumstances and everything to do with the human need for connection. She'd spent so many years surrounded by people in the crowded tenements and busy factories of Pittsburgh, yet she'd never felt more alone than during those endless shifts at the textile mill, performing mindless tasks while her spirit slowly withered from lack of purpose or hope. "How long can I stay?" she asked, the question emerging from her deepest fears about what would happen when she was strong enough to leave this sanctuary. "I know I'm imposing on your kindness, and I don't want to take advantage of your generosity, but I honestly don't know where else I could go." Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing serious but not unkind. Kate, you can stay as long as you need to. As long as you want to. This house has been empty except for me for years, and having someone here who appreciates its comforts makes it feel more like a home than it has in longer than I care to admit. The offer was more generous than anything she'd dared hope for, but it also raised questions about expectations and obligations that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "What would you want in return?" I don't have money to pay for room and board, and I need you to understand that I won't accept charity if it comes with conditions that compromise my independence." Daniel's expression darkened slightly, and she realized her question had touched on something that angered him, though not at her. "Emma Kate, whatever situation you were running from in Pittsburgh, whatever man made you feel that kindness always comes with a price, I need you to understand that not all men view women as commodities to be purchased or obligations to be collected on." His words hit closer to the truth than she'd expected, and she felt tears gathering in her eyes as the fear and exhaustion of the past weeks finally caught up with her. "I'm sorry, you've been nothing but kind to me, and I'm responding with suspicion you don't deserve. It's just that my experience has taught me to be careful about accepting help from men, especially men with the means to make demands if they choose to." "Then your experience has been with the wrong kind of men," Daniel said firmly. "And I give you my word that whatever you choose to do, however long you decide to stay, it will be your choice entirely. You're not obligated to me for anything beyond getting well and deciding what you want your future to look like." As Emma Kate looked into his eyes, and saw only sincerity and genuine concern for her welfare, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of trust, the hope that perhaps not every act of kindness was a trap waiting to be sprung, and the dawning realization that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, in the most unlikely places, offered by people who asked for nothing in return, except the simple pleasure of being able to help. Part 5. Recovery and growing understanding. The storm that had delivered Emma Kate to Daniel's doorstep raged for 3 more days, transforming Copper Ridge into a world of pristine white silence, broken only by the occasional crack of tree limbs surrendering to the weight of accumulated snow. During those days of enforced isolation, Emma Kate discovered that recovery involved more than simply regaining her physical strength. It meant learning to trust again, to accept kindness without constantly calculating the price that would eventually be demanded. Daniel proved to be an attentive caregiver who somehow managed to tend to her needs without making her feel helpless or dependent. He brought her meals prepared with the kind of attention to both nutrition and flavor that spoke of genuine cooking skill rather than mere adequacy. And he seemed to understand instinctively when she needed companionship, and when she needed solitude to process the magnitude of the change in her circumstances. On the second morning, when she felt strong enough to leave the bed for more than brief necessary trips, he'd helped her to a comfortable chair by the window where she could watch the snow continue to fall across the spectacular vista that his mountain home commanded. The view was unlike anything she'd experienced during her city-bound life, an endless expanse of forested peaks and valleys that seemed to stretch to the very edge of the world. "It's beautiful," she'd murmured, unable to find words adequate to describe the sense of space and grandeur that the mountain landscape provided. "I never imagined that such places existed, that someone could wake up every morning to something so magnificent. It took me a while to stop taking it for granted," Daniel admitted, settling into the chair beside her with his own cup of coffee. "When you grow up in these mountains, you tend to think of them as obstacles rather than scenery, things that make travel difficult and farming nearly impossible. It wasn't until I'd spent time in cities that I realized what I had here." His comment opened the door to conversations about their respective backgrounds, careful exchanges of information that revealed compatible experiences despite their different circumstances. Emma Kate found herself telling him about her childhood in Pittsburgh, the immigrant community where she'd grown up speaking Irish Gaelic as often as English, the way her parents had worked themselves to death trying to create opportunities for their children that they'd never had themselves. "My father always said that education was the only inheritance he could give us that couldn't be stolen or lost," she explained, remembering Patrick Sullivan's calloused hands turning the pages of the books he'd somehow managed to acquire despite the family's desperate poverty. "He made sure I could read and write and cipher, even when it meant sacrificing other things we needed." Daniel nodded with understanding that came from similar experience. "My mother felt the same way. She used to say that a person could lose everything they owned, but knowledge was something that stayed with you no matter what happened. I think that's why I kept studying even after I started making money, why I've collected all these books even though there's no one here to impress with them." The library that occupied an entire wing of his house became their favorite gathering place during the long afternoons when the storm made outdoor activity impossible. Emma Kate had never seen so many books in one place outside of the public library in Pittsburgh. And these were clearly working volumes rather than display pieces, marked with the evidence of regular use and serious study. "You can read any of them you like," Daniel offered, gesturing toward the floor-to-ceiling shelves that contained everything from classical literature to technical treatises on geology and engineering. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to discuss books with, someone who reads for the pleasure of learning rather than just to pass time." Emma Kate selected volumes carefully, choosing works that would challenge her understanding and expand her knowledge of subjects she'd never had the opportunity to study formally. Daniel proved to be an excellent discussion partner, someone who could explain complex concepts without condescension, and who genuinely seemed to enjoy her questions and observations. Their conversations ranged far beyond books, encompassing philosophy and politics, science and art, the kind of wide-ranging intellectual exploration that Emma Kate had dreamed of during her years of mind-numbing factory work. She discovered that Daniel's education, while largely self-directed, was remarkably comprehensive, and his insights were sharpened by practical experience that gave weight to theoretical knowledge. "You should have been a teacher," she told him one afternoon, as they discussed a particularly complex passage from Adam Smith's economic theories. "You have a gift for making difficult concepts understandable, and you never make me feel ignorant for asking questions that probably seem elementary to you." "I should probably have been many things," Daniel replied with a wistfulness that suggested some regret about the path his life had taken. "But circumstances have a way of determining our choices as much as our preferences do. I needed to survive first, to create security for myself, before I could afford the luxury of pursuing interests that didn't have immediate practical value." Emma Kate understood that sentiment better than he might have realized. Her own dreams of education and intellectual development had been sacrificed to the necessity of earning wages that would keep her fed and housed, and she'd often wondered what kind of person she might have become if poverty hadn't forced her into premature adulthood and endless cycles of exhausting labor. "What were your dreams?" Daniel asked, seeming to read the direction of her thoughts. "Before circumstances forced you into situations you didn't choose, what did you imagine your life might become?" The question touched on longings she'd learned to suppress as impractical and self-indulgent, but something about Daniel's genuine interest in the safety of her current surroundings made honesty seem possible. "I wanted to write," she admitted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks at the boldness of her confession. "Stories, articles, maybe even books someday. I used to imagine that I could capture the experiences of people like my parents, immigrants who sacrificed everything for their children's futures, workers whose stories never get told because they don't have the education or the platform to tell them." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful, and she could see him considering her words with the same seriousness he'd applied to their discussions of economics and philosophy. "What stopped you? Besides the obvious practical considerations, I mean. What kept you from pursuing writing even as a hobby or side interest?" "Time mostly, and energy. After 12 hours at the factory, there wasn't much left for creative pursuits, but also confidence, I suppose. It seemed presumptuous to think that someone like me, without formal education or connections in the literary world, could produce anything that people would want to read. That's the biggest lie that poverty teaches us," Daniel said with unexpected vehemence. "That our thoughts and experiences are somehow less valuable because we don't have the right credentials or social connections. Some of the most important stories I've read were written by people who lived them rather than people who studied them in universities." His passion surprised her, and she realized that this was a subject that touched on his own experience with social barriers and class prejudice. "You've faced that yourself, haven't you? People who assume that because of your background, your success must be somehow illegitimate or temporary." "More often than I care to admit," Daniel confirmed. "There's a particular kind of condescension that educated people reserve for those they consider self-made, as if success that doesn't come with the proper pedigree is somehow suspect. I've learned to navigate those waters, but it never stops being exhausting to constantly prove that you belong in rooms where your presence is questioned. Emma Kate felt a deep recognition of that particular burden. The way poverty marked you with invisible signs that seemed to follow you even when your circumstances improved. At the factory, the supervisors treated us like we were barely human, as if the ability to work with our hands somehow meant we couldn't think with our minds. They acted surprised when any of us showed intelligence or education, as if those qualities were incompatible with economic necessity. Which is exactly why your stories need to be told, Daniel insisted, leaning forward in his chair with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Not by social reformers or journalists who observe from the outside, but by someone who lived it, who understands the daily reality of that world in ways that no amount of research could provide. The encouragement in his voice sparked something in Emma Kate's chest that she'd thought permanently extinguished by years of disappointment and practical compromise. For the first time since childhood, she allowed herself to imagine that her dreams might be possible, that the experiences that had seemed like nothing but obstacles might actually be the foundation for work that mattered. "Would you really want to read such stories?" she asked, hardly daring to believe that her experiences might have value beyond their role in teaching her survival skills. Stories about immigrant families and factory workers, people who struggle just to put food on their tables. "I'd be honored to read them," Daniel replied with complete sincerity. "And I think you'd be surprised by how many other people would be as well." The stories that get published in the magazines and newspapers are mostly about people whose problems are whether to attend this social event or that one, whose biggest concerns are matters of fashion and social position. There's a hunger for truth, for stories about real struggles and genuine human resilience. Their conversations about writing led naturally to discussions of literature, and Emma Kate discovered that Daniel's library contained works by authors she'd only heard mentioned in passing. Writers whose books had been far beyond her financial reach during her working years. He encouraged her to read widely, to study not just the stories themselves but the techniques that made them effective. "Pay attention to how they handled dialogue," he suggested as she selected a novel by George Eliot. "Notice how they reveal character through the way people speak. How they make you understand personality and motivation without simply telling you what to think about each person." Emma Kate threw herself into reading with the enthusiasm of someone finally given access to treasures she'd been denied. But she also began to write, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as Daniel's encouragement convinced her that her voice had value. She started with simple sketches of people she'd known, workers and immigrants whose stories had never been recorded anywhere except in her memory. Daniel proved to be an excellent first reader, offering suggestions that improved her work without crushing her confidence. He had an intuitive understanding of what made writing effective, and his comments were always constructive rather than dismissive. Under his guidance, Emma Kate began to see her experiences not as shameful secrets to be hidden, but as valuable material that could illuminate truths about American life that more privileged writers might never encounter. "Your description of the factory floor is remarkable," he told her after reading one of her longer pieces. "I can almost hear the noise of the machinery, feel the heat and humidity, understand the way that environment shapes everything about the people who work there. You're not just describing a place, you're creating a world that readers can enter and understand." The validation was intoxicating, but even more important was the sense of partnership that developed as they worked together on improving her writing. Daniel never tried to impose his own voice on her work, but he helped her find ways to make her natural voice stronger and more effective. He showed her how to structure narrative for maximum impact, how to use specific details to create universal emotions, how to balance description with action in ways that kept readers engaged. As the days passed and her strength returned completely, Emma Kate found herself reluctant to think about the practical questions that would eventually require answers. She couldn't stay indefinitely as Daniel's guest, no matter how welcome he made her feel, and she had no clear plan for what would come next. Her flight from Pittsburgh had been motivated by desperation rather than strategy, and now she needed to consider what kind of future might be possible for a woman with no money, no connections, and no home to return to. Daniel seemed to sense her growing anxiety about these unresolved issues, and he addressed them with the same thoughtful consideration he brought to all their interactions. Emma Kate, I hope you know that you're welcome to stay here as long as you choose to. This house has plenty of room, and I've enjoyed having someone to share it with more than I can adequately express. But I can't be a permanent guest, she protested, though the thought of leaving this sanctuary filled her with dread. I need to find work, to create some kind of independent life for myself. I can't simply live on your charity indefinitely, no matter how generously it's offered. What if it wasn't charity? Daniel asked carefully, and she could see that he'd been thinking about this problem as seriously as she had. What if we could find a way for you to contribute something valuable here, something that would make your presence beneficial rather than simply welcomed? Emma Kate studied his face, searching for any sign of the manipulative calculation she'd learned to fear in men who offered solutions to women's problems. Instead, she found only genuine concern for her welfare, and what appeared to be a sincere desire to find an arrangement that would preserve her dignity while allowing her to stay. What did you have in mind? She asked, curious, despite her wariness about arrangements that seemed too good to be true. Daniel hesitated for a moment, as if he were uncertain about proposing something that might be presumptuous or unwelcome. My business correspondence has grown quite extensive over the years, and I've been managing it myself because I couldn't find anyone with the education and discretion necessary to handle confidential matters properly. If you were interested, I could offer you a position as my secretary and business assistant, with a salary that would allow you to maintain your independence while contributing skills that I genuinely need. The offer was more generous than anything Emma Kate had dared hope for, but it also raised questions about propriety and social conventions that made her hesitate. Wouldn't such an arrangement create problems for your reputation? An unmarried woman living in your household, even as an employee, might cause talk that could damage your standing in the community. Let me worry about my reputation, Daniel said firmly. The people whose opinions matter to me will judge the arrangement by its substance rather than its appearance. And those whose opinions don't matter will find something to criticize regardless of what I do. Besides, anyone who's spent time around here knows that I do things my own way, and I've never been particularly concerned with conforming to other people's expectations. Emma Kate found herself smiling at his dismissive attitude toward social conventions, recognizing the same independent spirit that had driven her own flight from circumstances she couldn't accept. You're certain this wouldn't be charity disguised as employment? I need to know that I'd be earning my salary through genuine contribution rather than simply receiving payment for existing in your vicinity. I can promise you that the work would be real and necessary. Daniel assured her, I currently spend hours each week on correspondence that could be handled more efficiently by someone with better organizational skills than I possess. My filing system is adequate for my own purposes, but it's not exactly what you'd call professional. And there are aspects of business management that would benefit from a fresh perspective, especially from someone who understands the experiences of working people in ways that I'm still learning. The more they discussed the practical details, the more appealing the arrangement became. Emma Kate would have her own suite of rooms in the house, with complete privacy and independence. Her salary would be generous enough to allow her to save money for future plans, whatever those might eventually become. Most importantly, the work would use skills she developed through education and experience, rather than simply requiring her to perform domestic labor that anyone could do. There's one more thing, Daniel added, and she could see that this was something particularly important to him. I'd want you to continue your writing as well. Consider it part of your duties, if that makes it easier to accept. I think your stories could make a real difference in how people understand the experiences of workers and immigrants, and I'd be honored to help you find ways to publish them when you're ready. The combination of meaningful work, financial independence, and encouragement for her writing ambitions was more than Emma Kate had imagined possible when she'd fled into the mountains with nothing but desperation driving her forward. But even as gratitude flooded through her, she felt compelled to address the underlying question that neither of them had quite voiced directly. Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer rather than simply what you think I want to hear. She paused, gathering her courage for a question that felt dangerous but necessary. Is this offer motivated purely by business considerations and kindness, or are there personal feelings involved that I should understand before making my decision? Daniel's expression grew serious, and she could see him weighing his words carefully before responding. Emma Kate, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending that my feelings are purely professional. Having you here has reminded me what it feels like to share my life with someone whose company I genuinely enjoy, whose mind challenges and stimulates my own thinking. But I'm offering you this position because I believe you'd be genuinely valuable as an employee, and I give you my word that accepting it would create no obligations beyond those that are explicitly professional. His honesty was both reassuring and slightly disappointing, though Emma Kate couldn't quite define what she'd hoped to hear instead. And if my feelings should develop beyond the purely professional, would that create complications that might make the arrangement untenable? Only if those feelings were unwelcome or unreciprocated, Daniel replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. But that's a bridge we can cross if and when we come to it. For now, I'm simply offering you work that would allow you to stay in a place where you found safety, with the freedom to decide what your future holds without pressure from anyone, including me. Emma Kate felt her heart racing as she considered not just the practical advantages of his offer, but the possibilities it represented for a kind of life she'd never dared imagine. A home where she was valued for her mind as well as her contributions, work that would engage her intellect and skills, the opportunity to pursue writing ambitions that had seemed impossibly remote just weeks before. And underlying it all, the presence of a man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who seemed to see her as a complete person rather than simply a collection of assets or liabilities. I accept, she said, extending her hand to shake on the agreement in the formal manner that business arrangements required. But when Daniel took her hand, the contact sent warmth up her arm that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the fireplace, and she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own growing awareness that their partnership might develop into something far more significant than either of them was quite ready to acknowledge. As they sat together in the comfortable library, discussing the practical details of her new position while snow continued to fall beyond the windows, Emma Kate felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The sense that the future held possibilities, rather than simply obstacles. That her story was just beginning, rather than being determined by circumstances beyond her control. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them from a position of strength rather than desperation, supported by work that mattered and a man who had proven that kindness without conditions was possible, even in a world that had taught her to expect the worst from every human interaction. The transformation from desperate refugee to valued employee and potential partner represented more than just a change in circumstances. It was a fundamental shift in how Emma Kate understood her own worth and potential. For the first time in years, she felt like the protagonist of her own story rather than simply a victim of forces beyond her control. And the sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying in its implications for everything she'd believed about what her life could become. Part 6. Daily partnership and mutual discovery. Spring's arrival in the mountains of Copper Ridge brought with it a transformation that seemed to mirror the changes taking place within the walls of Daniel Mitchell's mansion. The snow that had held the world in pristine silence began its gradual retreat, revealing landscapes that had been hidden for months beneath winter's blanket. Streams that had been frozen solid now rushed with snowmelt, their voices joining the symphony of returning birds and the whisper of wind through branches that showed the first tentative signs of budding life. Emma Kate had settled into her role as Daniel's business assistant with a competence that surprised them both, bringing organizational skills and attention to detail that transformed his somewhat haphazard record-keeping into a model of efficiency. Her background in factory work had taught her the value of systematic processes, while her education allowed her to handle correspondence and documentation with a sophistication that impressed even Daniel's most demanding business associates. The morning routine they'd developed reflected their growing comfort with each other's presence and working styles. Emma Kate would arrive at the office Daniel had created for her in what had once been a formal parlor, finding on her desk the correspondence that had arrived via the weekly mail delivery from Millbrook Valley. She'd sort through the letters and telegrams, prioritizing urgent matters and preparing summaries of routine business that allowed Daniel to make decisions efficiently without becoming bogged down in unnecessary details. Their first collaborative task each day involved reviewing the reports from Daniel's various operations, a process that had become one of Emma Kate's favorite parts of her new responsibilities. The copper mines, timber operations and cattle ranches generated streams of information that painted a comprehensive picture of a business empire more complex and far-reaching than she'd initially understood. Daniel's success wasn't simply the result of lucky strikes or favorable circumstances, but of careful planning and intelligent adaptation to changing market conditions. The Baltimore buyers are offering 3 cents more per board foot than we received last quarter, Emma Kate observed one morning as she reviewed the timber contracts that had arrived with the previous day's mail. But they're also requesting delivery schedules that would require us to increase production by nearly 20%. Do we have the capacity to meet those demands without compromising quality? Daniel looked up from the geological survey he'd been studying, his expression showing the kind of pleased surprise that had become increasingly common as Emma Kate demonstrated her growing understanding of his business concerns. That's exactly the right question to ask. Most people would focus on the increased revenue without considering the operational implications. The answer is that we could meet their demands, but only by hiring additional crews and possibly working longer shifts, which would increase our costs and might affect worker safety. These discussions had evolved beyond simple employer-employee exchanges into genuine consultations between partners who respected each other's insights and perspectives. Emma Kate's questions often highlighted aspects of business decisions that Daniel might have overlooked, while his experience provided context that helped her understand the broader implications of seemingly simple choices. What if we counter-offered with a 15% increase in production at a premium price that reflects the additional costs? Emma Kate suggested, already calculating figures in her head. We could frame it as a quality assurance measure, ensuring that increased volume doesn't compromise the standards that have made our timber so sought after in the first place. Brilliant, Daniel replied, making notes on the contract terms. That approach protects our workers, maintains our reputation, and actually increases our profit margins rather than simply our gross revenue. You have an instinct for this kind of negotiation that most businessmen spend years trying to develop. The praise warmed Emma Kate in ways that went beyond professional satisfaction, touching on deeper needs for recognition and respect that had gone unmet during her years of anonymous factory labor. Working with Daniel allowed her to engage intellectual capacities that had been dormant for so long she'd almost forgotten they existed, and his genuine appreciation for her contributions fed a hunger for meaningful work that she hadn't even realized she possessed. Their collaboration extended beyond the formal business correspondence that constituted her official duties. Daniel had begun involving her in strategic planning sessions where they discussed long-term development of his various enterprises, conversations that revealed the scope of his ambitions and the thoughtfulness of his approach to growth. Unlike the rapacious industrialist she'd read about in newspapers, Daniel seemed genuinely concerned with sustainable practices that would benefit his workers and the surrounding community rather than simply maximizing short-term profits. I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding worker housing, Daniel said one afternoon as they reviewed plans for expanding the main mining operation. Building company houses has traditionally been a way for owners to control their workforce. But what if we approached it differently? What if we offered workers the opportunity to purchase their homes through payroll deductions, so they'd build equity instead of simply paying rent? Emma Kate felt a thrill of excitement at seeing her ideas taken seriously and developed into concrete proposals. That would give them a real stake in the community's success, wouldn't it? And it would attract more skilled workers who are looking for stability rather than just temporary employment. Exactly. And from a business standpoint, workers who own their homes are more likely to stay long enough for us to recover our training investments. It's the kind of approach that benefits everyone involved rather than simply extracting maximum value from one side of the relationship. These philosophical discussions about business ethics and social responsibility revealed aspects of Daniel's character that Emma Kate found increasingly attractive. His wealth hadn't made him callous or indifferent to the struggles of working people. Instead, it had given him the freedom to implement practices that reflected his genuine values rather than simply following conventional approaches that prioritized profit above all other considerations. Her writing had also flourished under Daniel's continued encouragement and the intellectual stimulation of their daily interactions. The stories she crafted in the evenings, after her business duties were complete, had grown more sophisticated and powerful as she gained confidence in her ability to translate experience into narrative that could move and educate readers. Daniel's suggestions about technique and structure had helped her develop a distinctive voice that was both accessible and emotionally compelling. This piece about the factory fire is remarkable, Daniel told her after reading her latest story, a fictionalized account based on a tragedy she'd witnessed in Pittsburgh. The way you describe the workers' dilemma between staying at their posts and fleeing to safety captures something essential about the impossible choices that poverty forces on people. Readers will understand viscerally what it means to risk your life for a job you can't afford to lose. Emma Kate felt tears prick her eyes as she remembered the actual event that had inspired the story, the way workers had hesitated to evacuate because leaving their stations without permission could result in termination. I wanted people who've never faced that kind of decision to understand that heroism and cowardice look different when you're choosing between immediate danger and the certainty of your family going hungry. You've succeeded completely, Daniel assured her. This isn't just a story, it's a window into a world that most comfortable people never see. Have you considered submitting some of your work to magazines? I think you'd be surprised by how receptive editors might be to perspectives they're not getting from their usual contributors. The suggestion both thrilled and terrified Emma Kate, representing a step toward the kind of public recognition she'd dreamed of but never quite believed possible. Do you really think they're good enough? Professional publications have standards that might be beyond what I can achieve without formal training. Emma Kate, formal training is valuable, but it can't replace authentic experience and natural talent. Your writing has both truth and artistry, which is a combination that most trained writers struggle to achieve. Besides, the worst that can happen is rejection, and even that provides valuable information about what editors are looking for. Daniel's confidence in her abilities gave Emma Kate the courage to begin selecting and polishing pieces for submission, a process that required her to view her own work with the critical eye of a professional rather than simply the satisfaction of personal expression. The discipline of revision and refinement improved her writing skills while also helping her understand her own artistic development more clearly. Their working relationship had also created opportunities for personal interactions that revealed compatible interests and values beyond their professional collaboration. Evening meals had become extended conversations about books, ideas, current events, and philosophical questions that neither of them had previously had the opportunity to explore with someone who shared their intellectual curiosity. I've been reading about the labor movements in Europe, Emma Kate mentioned one evening as they shared dinner in the mansion's elegant dining room. The idea that workers might organize collectively to negotiate better conditions and wages seems to be gaining momentum there. Do you think such developments might eventually reach American industries? Daniel considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries about complex social and economic issues. I think it's inevitable and probably necessary. The current system that gives all negotiating power to employers creates imbalances that ultimately harm everyone involved. Workers who are treated fairly and paid adequately are more productive and loyal, while those who are exploited eventually become desperate enough to disrupt entire industries. But wouldn't organized labor threaten the kind of business success you've achieved? If workers could demand higher wages and better conditions, wouldn't that reduce profits significantly? Short-term profits perhaps, but not long-term prosperity. I've found that investing in worker welfare actually improves my bottom line because I have less turnover, fewer accidents, and higher productivity. The businesses that will thrive in the future are those that understand that their workers are assets to be developed rather than resources to be consumed. These conversations reveal the depth of social consciousness that set Daniel apart from other wealthy men Emma Kate had encountered, even in limited circumstances. His success hadn't isolated him from understanding the experiences of working people. Instead, it had given him the perspective to see how individual prosperity was connected to broader social welfare. The personal attraction that had been growing quietly beneath their professional partnership began to manifest in small gestures and moments of awareness that neither of them explicitly acknowledged, but both increasingly noticed. Emma Kate found herself paying more attention to her appearance on mornings when she knew they'd be working closely together, while Daniel seemed to find more excuses for conversations that extended beyond strictly business matters. "You've been working too hard," Daniel observed one evening when he found Emma Kate still at her desk long after normal business hours, surrounded by correspondence and financial documents. "This can wait until tomorrow, and you need time for your own interests as well as mine." "I don't mind the work," Emma Kate replied honestly. "For the first time in my life, I'm using my mind for something meaningful rather than simply performing repetitive tasks that anyone could do." Even when it's challenging, it feels like privilege rather than burden. Daniel moved closer to her desk, and she was suddenly aware of his physical presence in ways that had nothing to do with their professional relationship. Still, everyone needs balance. What would you like to do for yourself this evening? Read something purely for pleasure, work on your writing, take a walk outside now that the weather's finally cooperated. The simple question opened up possibilities that Emma Kate hadn't considered. Reminders that her new circumstances included leisure time and personal choice in ways that had been absent from her life for so many years that she'd almost forgotten they existed. A walk sounds wonderful, actually. I've been so focused on indoor work that I haven't really experienced spring's arrival except through the windows. Then let's go explore what the season has done to my mountain, Daniel suggested, offering his arm with a gallantry that made her pulse quicken. There are paths through the forest that lead to viewpoints you haven't seen yet, places where you can understand why I chose to build my life in such a remote location. As they stepped outside together into the soft evening air, Emma Kate felt a shift in their relationship that went beyond the comfortable working partnership they'd established. Walking beside Daniel through the awakening landscape, breathing air that carried the sense of new growth and possibility, she began to imagine futures that included not just professional success and artistic achievement, but personal happiness of a kind she'd never dared hope might be available to someone with her history and circumstances. Part 7. The First Major Truth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, delivered by a postal rider whose grim expression suggested he carried more than routine correspondence. Emma Kate was organizing the weekly reports from Daniel's various operations when she noticed the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope. The expensive stationery that spoke of wealth and authority, the official seals that marked it as something far more serious than ordinary business communication. "Daniel," she called, her voice carrying a note of concern that brought him quickly from his office. "There's something here that I think you should see immediately." The envelope bore the letterhead of Blackwood Industries, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and was addressed to Daniel Mitchell with a formality that seemed ominous in its precision. Daniel's expression darkened as he read the return address, and Emma Kate felt her stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety that had plagued her during her worst days in the city. "Victor Blackwood," Daniel said quietly, tearing open the envelope with movements that were carefully controlled but somehow violent. "That name means something to you, doesn't it?" Emma Kate felt the blood drain from her face as memories she'd tried to bury came flooding back with devastating clarity. "He's the man I was running from when I ended up on your mountain. The one who threatened me when I refused his marriage proposal, who made it clear that my safety depended on accepting his terms." Daniel's jaw clenched as he unfolded the letter, and Emma Kate could see anger building in his dark eyes as he read the carefully crafted words that she somehow knew would change everything about their peaceful existence on Copper Ridge. When he finished reading, he handed her the letter without comment, his face set in lines that spoke of barely controlled fury. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation disguised as polite inquiry, written in language that managed to be both respectful and threatening in equal measure. Victor Blackwood wrote that he was concerned about a young woman named Emma Kate Sullivan who had disappeared from Pittsburgh under circumstances that suggested mental instability or possible coercion. He claimed to be acting on behalf of her family, who were desperate to locate their missing daughter and ensure her safety. More concerning were the implications beneath the surface courtesy. Victor's letter mentioned his business connections throughout the region, his influence with local law enforcement, and his resources for conducting thorough investigations when the welfare of innocent people was at stake. He expressed hope that any honorable gentleman who might have encountered Miss Sullivan would assist in reuniting her with her worried family, and he provided contact information for reporting any relevant information. "It's all lies," Emma Kate said, her voice shaking with a combination of fear and rage. "I have no family in Pittsburgh who would be looking for me, and Victor knows that perfectly well. This is about control and possession, about his inability to accept that someone would dare to refuse his demands." "I believe you completely," Daniel replied, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of steel that Emma Kate had never heard before. "But belief and proof are different things in the eyes of the law.
And this letter suggests that Victor Blackwood has resources that could make our lives very difficult if he chooses to use them. Emma Kate sank into a chair, feeling the walls of her new life closing in around her with the same suffocating pressure she'd felt in Pittsburgh. He's found me. Despite everything, despite how careful I was, despite how remote this place seemed, he's found me. And now he's going to destroy everything good that's happened since I escaped. No, Daniel said firmly, moving to kneel beside her chair and taking her hands in his. He's found out where you are, but that doesn't mean he's found a way to take you away from here. This is my land, my jurisdiction, and my responsibility to protect the people under my roof. Victor Blackwood may have money and connections, but he's never faced someone who's willing to fight for what
matters to him. The declaration sent warmth through Emma Kate's chest, but it also raised questions about the cost that such protection might require. Daniel, you don't understand what you're up against. Victor isn't just wealthy, he's ruthless in ways that respectable people can't imagine. He has political connections that could bring government pressure to bear, legal resources that could tie you up in courts for years, business leverage that could affect your operations throughout the region. Then he's about to learn that money isn't the only form of power available to determine people. Daniel replied, rising to pace the room with restless energy that suggested he was already formulating plans. I didn't build this empire by backing down from bullies. And I'm not about to start now when the stakes are more important than they've ever been. Emma Kate watched him move around the room, noting the way his posture had changed from the relaxed demeanor of a man content with his peaceful existence to the controlled intensity of someone preparing for war. What are you thinking? What kind of resources do you have that could match what Victor can bring against us? More than you might expect, Daniel said, stopping at the window that overlooked his domain. I've spent 15 years building relationships with people throughout these mountains, employing workers who depend on me for their livelihoods, creating alliances with other businessmen who share my interests. Victor Blackwood may have influence in Pittsburgh, but this is my territory. And I know every trail, every settlement, every person who matters for 100 miles in any direction. The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Emma Kate had learned through bitter experience that underestimating Victor's capabilities was a dangerous mistake. He's not going to simply send threatening letters, Daniel. If he's made the effort to track me here, he's planning something more direct and more devastating than legal pressure. He has the resources to hire men who specialize in violence, investigators who can manufacture evidence to support whatever story serves his purposes. Good, Daniel replied, his expression growing cold in a way that reminded Emma Kate that his success hadn't been achieved through gentleness alone. Because I have something that his money can't buy. The absolute certainty that I'm fighting for someone who matters more to me than my own safety or comfort. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither had quite voiced before this moment of crisis. Emma Kate felt her heart racing as she processed not just the danger they faced, but the revelation of feelings that transformed their relationship from professional partnership into something far more personal and profound. Daniel, she said softly, rising from her chair to face him directly. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Because if you are, I need to know that it's not just protective instinct or misplaced chivalry. I need to know that these feelings are real, because they're going to determine how I respond to whatever Victor has planned. Emma Kate, Daniel replied, crossing the room to stand close enough that she could see the intensity in his dark eyes. I'm saying that finding you half frozen on my doorstep was the best thing that's happened to me in 15 years of building what I thought was everything I wanted. I'm saying that these months of working together, talking together, sharing this life together, have shown me what I've been missing all this time. I've been accumulating wealth without purpose. He reached up to cup her face gently, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. I'm saying that I love you, Emma Kate Sullivan, and that I'd rather lose everything I've built than let Victor Blackwood or anyone else take you away from me. But more than that, I'm saying that I believe we can win this fight, that we can protect what we've found together and build something even stronger from facing this challenge. The kiss that followed was inevitable, born of love acknowledged under pressure, and the urgent need to claim what they'd discovered before external forces could destroy it. Emma Kate melted into Daniel's embrace, feeling years of loneliness and fear dissolve in the warmth of genuine love offered and received without conditions or calculations. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard, and Emma Kate could see her own determination reflected in Daniel's expression. "Then we fight," she said simply. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, we fight for this. Because what we have is worth fighting for, and I'm tired of running from men who think they can control my life simply because they have more money than conscience." "We fight," Daniel agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss that tasted of hope and defiance in equal measure. "But first we prepare. Victor Blackwood is about to discover that threatening someone under my protection was the biggest mistake he's ever made." The next several days were spent in intense preparation for whatever form Victor's next move might take. Daniel activated networks of contacts and allies that Emma Kate hadn't known existed, calling in favors and sharing information with people whose loyalty had been earned through years of fair dealing and mutual respect. The scope of his influence throughout the region became apparent as responses arrived from mine owners and timber operators, local sheriffs and territorial officials, even some federal marshals who remembered Daniel's reputation from his younger days. "I wasn't always a businessman," Daniel explained one evening as they reviewed the intelligence that had been gathered about Victor's activities. "Before I struck it rich with the copper mines, I spent some time working with law enforcement, helping track down claim jumpers and other criminals who thought the mountains were a good place to hide from justice. Some of those contacts have proven very useful for staying informed about threats to my operations." Emma Kate was impressed by the thoroughness of the information network that Daniel had maintained. But she was also disturbed by some of the reports that arrived about Victor's recent activities. "He's been hiring investigators throughout Pennsylvania and West Virginia, offering substantial rewards for information about my whereabouts. And some of these men aren't the sort who worry about legal niceties when they're pursuing someone their employer wants found." "Which is exactly what I expected," Daniel replied grimly. "Victor Blackwood strikes me as the type of man who's never been told no by anyone, especially not by a woman he considers his property. He's not going to accept defeat gracefully, and he's certainly not going to respect boundaries that inconvenience his desires." The preparation also involved practical measures to improve the security of Daniel's mountain estate. Additional workers were hired, men whose primary qualifications involved their skill with firearms and their loyalty to Daniel rather than their ability to mine copper or cut timber. Lookout posts were established at strategic points along the trails that led to the mansion, and communication systems were put in place to provide early warning of approaching strangers. "I don't want to turn our home into an armed camp," Daniel explained as they watched workers install new locks and reinforce window shutters. "But I also don't want to be caught unprepared if Victor decides that direct action is more effective than legal pressure." Emma Kate found herself struggling with guilt about the upheaval that her presence had brought to Daniel's previously peaceful existence. "I'm sorry," she said one afternoon, as they watched armed guards take their positions around the property. "I never intended to bring violence and danger into your life. If I'd known that Victor would be able to track me here, I would never have involved you in my problems." "Emma Kate," Daniel replied, taking her hands and forcing her to meet his eyes. "You didn't bring danger into my life. You brought purpose and meaning and love into my life. The danger is simply the price we have to pay to protect those things, and it's a price I'm willing to pay gladly." His words helped ease her guilt, but they didn't eliminate her fear about what Victor might be planning. The man she'd fled from in Pittsburgh was capable of cruelties that went far beyond simple violence, and she knew that his wounded pride would demand retribution that was both comprehensive and deeply personal. "There's something else you need to understand about Victor," she said, forcing herself to share information that was painful to remember but necessary for their preparation. "He doesn't just want to punish me for defying him. He wants to own me completely, to break my spirit so thoroughly that I'll never again believe I have choices or rights that he doesn't control. If he can't have me willingly, he'll settle for having me as a broken thing that serves as an example to other women who might consider refusing his advances." Daniel's expression grew murderous as he processed the implications of her warning. "Then he's made an enemy of the wrong man. Because I'll die before I let anyone treat you that way. More importantly, he's underestimated the strength of the woman he's trying to intimidate. You're not the same person who fled Pittsburgh in desperation, Emma Kate. You're stronger now, more confident, surrounded by people who value and respect you. He's going to find that the woman he thinks he's hunting no longer exists. The truth of Daniel's observation gave Emma Kate strength she hadn't realized she possessed. The months of meaningful work, intellectual stimulation, and genuine love had indeed transformed her from a desperate victim into someone capable of fighting for her own happiness. Victor Blackwood was about to discover that the frightened factory worker he'd intimidated in Pittsburgh had become someone very different. Someone with resources and allies and the absolute determination to protect the life she'd built. "Let him come," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Let him bring whatever forces he thinks necessary to claim what he believes belongs to him. He's going to learn that some things can't be bought or stolen or intimidated into submission, and that the woman he thought was his property has found something worth fighting for." As they stood together looking out over the mountain domain that had become their sanctuary and fortress, Emma Kate felt a fierce joy that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the certainty that she'd found not just love but a partner worthy of the battles that love sometimes required. Whatever Victor Blackwood brought against them, they would face it together, and that unity was a form of wealth that no amount of money could purchase or destroy. Part 8. Reciprocal Revelations. The attack came at dawn on a Wednesday morning in early June, when the mountain mist still clung to the valleys and the first light was just beginning to paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Emma Kate was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sharp whistle that Daniel's lookouts used to signal approaching strangers, followed immediately by the more urgent signal that meant armed men were climbing the main trail to the mansion. Daniel appeared at her side within seconds, already dressed and carrying the rifle that had become a constant companion since Victor's threatening letter arrived. Emma Kate asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear that made her hands tremble as she reached for the pistol Daniel had taught her to use during their preparation for this moment. "At least 8, possibly more," Daniel replied, checking the loads in his weapons with practiced efficiency. "They're trying to approach from multiple directions, but our boys spotted them early enough to give us warning. Are you ready for this?" Emma Kate nodded, taking her position at the reinforced window that provided a clear view of the eastern approach to the house. "As ready as anyone can be for something like this. Daniel, if something happens to me, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me everything I never dared hope I could have. Nothing's going to happen to you," Daniel said firmly, moving to his own position at the front window. "We've prepared for this, we have good people covering the approaches, and Victor Blackwood is about to learn that money can't buy victory against people who are fighting for their home and their future." The first shots came from the tree line east of the house, rifle fire that shattered the morning quiet and sent splinters flying from the wooden shutters that protected the windows. Daniel's return fire was immediate and accurate, dropping one of the attackers and sending the others scrambling for better cover among the rocks and fallen logs that dotted the mountainside. "There's movement on the north trail too," Emma Kate called out, sighting down the barrel of her rifle at figures moving through the forest. 3 men, maybe 4, trying to circle around to the back of the house. Her shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the approaching men dive for cover and reconsider their approach. The battle that followed was unlike anything Emma Kate had imagined during their preparations, a chaotic mixture of gunfire and shouted orders that seemed to last for hours but was probably measured in minutes. Daniel's defensive preparations proved their worth as the attackers found themselves caught in crossfire from multiple positions. Their attempted coordination disrupted by terrain they didn't know and defenders who had every advantage of familiarity with the ground. "Emma Kate, there's someone approaching under a white flag," Daniel called from his position. "It looks like Victor himself, the arrogant bastard. He wants to parley, which probably means his hired guns aren't having the easy time he expected." Through the window, Emma Kate could see a figure emerging from the tree line, an expensive suit incongruous among the rough mountain landscape. A white handkerchief tied to a walking stick held high above his head. Even at a distance, she recognized Victor Blackwood's confident bearing. The way he moved as if he owned whatever ground his feet touched. "What do you think he wants?" Emma Kate asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer.
Victor wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and his presence here suggested that he had additional resources he hadn't yet deployed. He wants to make an offer, Daniel replied grimly. Something that he thinks will be too generous for us to refuse, probably combined with threats about what will happen if we don't accept his terms. Should we hear what he has to say? Emma Kate considered the question, weighing her curiosity about Victor's proposal against her instinctive distrust of anything he might offer. Yes, but carefully. Victor is most dangerous when he's being reasonable. When he's making offers that sound generous but have hidden costs that only become apparent later. Daniel called out his willingness to talk, and Victor approached the house with the careful confidence of a man who believed his money and connections made him untouchable even in hostile territory. When he was close enough for conversation without shouting, he stopped and removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Mr. Mitchell," Victor called out in the cultured tones that Emma Kate remembered with visceral distaste. "I believe we have a mutual interest in resolving this situation without further violence. I'm prepared to make you an offer that I think you'll find quite reasonable, given the circumstances." "I'm listening," Daniel replied, though his rifle remained ready, and his tone suggested that reasonable was a relative concept. "The young woman you're harboring is mentally unstable, Mr. Mitchell. She fled Pittsburgh after attacking a respected businessman and stealing a considerable sum of money. I'm prepared to overlook your unknowing assistance to a fugitive, and I'm even willing to compensate you for your trouble, if you'll simply allow me to take her back to receive the medical treatment she obviously needs." The lies rolled off Victor's tongue with practiced ease, and Emma Kate felt the familiar combination of rage and helplessness that had driven her to flee Pittsburgh in the first place. But now, surrounded by evidence of the life she'd built and supported by a man who loved her without conditions, the lies seemed less powerful, more obviously desperate. "What kind of compensation?" Daniel asked, and Emma Kate could hear the contempt in his voice, even though he was maintaining the pretense of negotiation. $50,000, Victor replied without hesitation. "Enough to make this unfortunate incident profitable for you, Mr. Mitchell. All you have to do is step aside and let me take custody of a woman who clearly can't be trusted to make rational decisions about her own welfare." The amount was staggering, more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. But Emma Kate wasn't surprised when Daniel's response came without hesitation. "Mr. Blackwood, I wouldn't turn over a rabid dog to someone like you for 50 times that amount. The woman under my protection is here by her own choice, and she'll leave only if and when she decides to do so." Victor's facade of reasonableness slipped slightly, revealing the cold anger that Emma Kate remembered from their confrontations in Pittsburgh. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't think you understand the forces you're dealing with. I have resources and connections that could make your life very difficult if you insist on interfering with my efforts to recover my property." "Your property?" Daniel's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Emma Kate proud of his unwavering support. "Mr. Blackwood, the only property here that concerns me is the land you're standing on, which belongs to me. And the woman you're threatening, who belongs to herself. I suggest you collect your hired thugs and leave my mountain before I decide that you're trespassing with hostile intent." "You're making a serious mistake, Mitchell," Victor replied, his mask dropping completely as his true nature emerged. "I have territorial marshals on my payroll, federal judges who owe me favors, enough political influence to have you charged with kidnapping and harboring a fugitive. Cross me and I'll destroy everything you've built here." "Then you'd better get started," Daniel replied calmly, "because I'm not moving, I'm not negotiating, and I'm not letting you take someone I love away from a place where she's finally found safety and happiness." The declaration of love, spoken publicly in defiance of Victor's threats, sent warmth through Emma Kate's chest even as she recognized that it had probably sealed their fate. Victor wasn't the type of man to accept such public rejection without extracting a price that would serve as an example to anyone else who might consider defying his will. "Love," Victor laughed, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever. "Mr. Mitchell, You've been deceived by a woman who specializes in manipulation and theft. Miss Sullivan is a practiced liar who will abandon you the moment she finds someone with more money or better prospects. I'm offering you the chance to profit from your mistake rather than suffer the consequences. Mr. Blackwood, Emma Kate called out, unable to remain silent in the face of such accusations. I think it's time you heard from the woman you're calling property. I am not mentally unstable. I have not stolen anything from you, and I am not going anywhere with you regardless of what threats or bribes you offer. Victor's expression grew ugly as he focused on her voice coming from the fortified house. Emma Kate, darling, you've obviously been influenced by this mountain man's crude advances. Come out here, and we can discuss your situation like civilized people. I'm prepared to forgive your recent behavior if you'll simply acknowledge your mistake and accept my guidance back to a proper life. The only mistake I made was not seeing your true nature sooner, Emma Kate replied, her voice carrying across the mountain air with clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. I would rather die on this mountain than spend one more day pretending that your control is love or that your ownership is protection. The finality of her rejection seemed to break something in Victor's carefully maintained composure. Fine, he snarled, his cultured facade disappearing entirely. If you want to play at being mountain people, you can die like mountain people. But understand this, both of you, I have enough men and resources to keep this siege going indefinitely. I can starve you out, burn you out, or simply wait until you make a mistake that gives me the opening I need. This ends only one way, with Emma Kate coming with me and Mr. Mitchell learning the price of interfering with his betters. Then I guess we'd better get comfortable. Daniel replied, his tone suggesting that Victor's threats had only strengthened his resolve. Because the only way Emma Kate leaves this mountain is if she chooses to, and the only way you're taking her anywhere is over my dead body. Victor's retreat to the tree line marked the end of negotiations and the beginning of what promised to be a protracted siege. Emma Kate watched him disappear into the forest and felt a strange sense of relief that the pretense was finally over, that the conflict had been reduced to its essential elements without any remaining illusions about Victor's intentions, or Daniel's commitment to protecting her. Are you ready for whatever comes next? Daniel asked, moving to her side as they watched for signs of renewed activity among the trees. I'm ready, Emma Kate replied, meaning it completely. For the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something that's truly mine. Something that no one has the right to take away from me. Whatever the cost, it's worth paying to protect what we've found together. As the siege of Copper Ridge began in earnest, with Victor's hired guns settling into positions around the mountain estate, Emma Kate felt a fierce joy that surprised her with its intensity. She was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer accepting that powerful men had the right to determine her fate. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she would face it as Daniel Mitchell's partner and equal, fighting for a love that had transformed her from a victim into someone worthy of the battles that true happiness sometimes required. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.